The room is quiet now, and the day is finally letting go. What if the earliest written words were not meant to celebrate beginnings, but to gently preserve a memory? If you'd like, you can quietly notice where you're listening from tonight, or simply let the thought pass as the story unfolds. And so, without urgency, we step away from the present and drift into a much older world, one shaped by rivers, clay, and a sky that was always being watched. Long before written history was meant to tell stories, it was meant to keep order. In the wide lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, life moved slowly and predictably. Seasons returned on time, floodwaters rose and retreated, crops followed familiar rhythms. The land rewarded patience and attention more than force. Above it all, the sky turned in quiet reliability. Stars appeared where they always had. The moon waxed and waned with soft regularity. Even the wandering lights, the planets, followed paths that could be learned through calm observation. This consistency was not taken for granted, it was carefully noted. When the first Sumerian cities began to form, they did so with an unusual sense of readiness. Streets were laid out with intention, buildings followed measured plans. Systems of trade, labour, and record-keeping appeared fully formed, as if inherited rather than invented. Writing emerged not as literature, but as memory made durable. Clay tablets were pressed, dried, and fired, not to express feelings or beliefs, but to preserve information that mattered enough to survive time. Grain counts, property boundaries, calendar dates, and, quietly among them, records of the sky. These celestial entries were gentle in tone. They did not argue or persuade, they simply stated what had been seen. A star rising earlier than usual, a light appearing in a particular season, intervals measured carefully from one event to the next. There is no excitement in the language, no sense of spectacle, only care. What draws attention is how confident these records already are. There is no evidence of trial and error, no gradual improvement preserved in the tablets. The system appears settled from the beginning, as if the observers already knew what mattered and what could be ignored. Even the buildings supported this quiet confidence. Early temples were positioned deliberately, their walls and stairways aligned to specific points on the horizon. From their raised platforms, observers could see far without obstruction. These were not enclosed sanctuaries, they were open spaces designed for watching. From such places, the sky could be followed night after night, season after season, with minimal interruption. Small changes became visible over time. Patterns revealed themselves slowly, without drama. And so knowledge accumulated calmly. Some tablets recorded cycles that extended far beyond a single lifetime. A return every few decades, another every few generations. These records do not explain how. The cycles were discovered. They assume continuity. The people reading these tablets were expected to already be part of the system. Occasionally, the calm tone shifts just enough to be noticeable. Certain periods are marked more carefully, certain lights are watched more closely. The language remains restrained, but attention sharpens. Not danger, exactly, but caution. These moments are not framed as disasters. They are treated the same way a farmer might treat a changing wind or a river rising slightly higher than expected. Something to note, something to remember. What stands out most is what the tablets do not contain. They do not explain why the sky deserves this attention. They never justify the effort. They behave as though the reason lies somewhere deeper than language. Beneath later ruins, archaeologists found older foundations. temples rebuilt again and again in the same locations. Each time, the orientation remained nearly identical, adjusted only slightly to match the slow changes of the heavens themselves. This was not tradition for tradition's sake, it was maintenance, and maintenance suggests inheritance. Later stories spoke of teachers who came after a great disruption, figures who restored lost knowledge and taught people how to live again. Over time, these figures became gods, and their lessons became myths. Yet the practical habits remained: watch, record, preserve. The sky above Mesopotamia was calm most nights. That calm is what made memory possible, and memory, once preserved, shaped everything that followed. As wind moved across the empty plains and stars traced their ancient paths overhead, generation after generation continued the same quiet task, never fully explaining why it mattered, only ensuring it was never forgotten. And that leaves us with a question spoken softly, without urgency. What kind of experience teaches people to watch the sky carefully, and then, over time, teaches them never to ask why? Night deepens gently over the land, and nothing feels hurried. The rivers continue their slow movement, reflecting points of light that seem almost fixed, even as they drift. From the ground, from the low rooftops, from the open platforms of early temples, the sky feels close enough to follow without effort. For the people who lived here, watching the heavens was not a special act. It was routine. Children grew up seeing elders pause at certain moments of the night. Young scribes learned not only how to press signs into clay, but when to look up before doing so. The habit passed quietly from one generation to the next, until it no longer needed instruction. The tablets reflect this calm inheritance. They are not filled with explanation, they are filled with trust. Trust that the reader understands the system. Trust that the reader already knows why this knowledge matters. Trust that the work will be continued. Some records describe long stretches of time with little variation. Seasons pass, patterns repeat. Nothing unusual is noted at all. These tablets feel almost reassuring, reminders that the world is behaving as expected. But then, without changing tone, others grow more attentive. A particular season is marked more carefully. A specific region of the sky is mentioned more than once. Counts become more precise. The writing remains restrained, but the focus narrows. This is how concern appears in a culture that values steadiness above emotion, not through alarm, but through attention. Later scholars would call these texts omens, but the word can be misleading. They were not predictions spoken with certainty, they were records of correlation, observations linking what appeared above with what followed below. When certain lights appeared, harvests failed more often. When brightness returned in specific cycles, disruption tended to follow. The tablets do not insist on causation, they do not demand belief, they simply preserve the pattern. What makes this preservation remarkable is how seamlessly it was woven into everyday life. Astronomy was not separate from administration. Sky records sat beside grain tallies and land divisions as if they belonged naturally together. Because they did. A society built on agriculture understood how dependent it was on forces beyond immediate control. Rain, heat, flood, all came from the same vast system that moved the stars. Watching the sky was simply an extension of watching the land. And yet, there was something more careful here than agricultural necessity alone would explain. The alignment of temples reveals that certain parts of the sky mattered more than others. Not the most beautiful constellations, not the brightest stars. Specific directions, specific times of year. Observers positioned themselves where they could see the horizon clearly at dawn and dusk, the moments when the sky changes most subtly. These were times when new lights might appear, briefly and quietly, before being swallowed by daylight or darkness. The architecture makes space for patience, stairs rising in measured steps, platforms wide enough for more than one observer, notches and edges that frame the sky without decoration, everything designed to reduce distraction. There is a humility in this design. The builders did not assume that understanding would come quickly. They assumed it would take time, perhaps more time than one life allowed, so they planned for succession. As centuries passed, stories developed around this steady watching. Gods became associated with certain lights. Narratives gave names and personalities to forces that were otherwise distant and impersonal. But beneath the stories, the practice stayed the same. When buildings crumbled, they were rebuilt. When records aged, they were recopied. When cycles completed, new counts began. Even political collapse did not interrupt this continuity for long. Rulers changed, dynasties fell, yet the scribal schools remained, quietly training observers who would outlast kings. This suggests something deeply ingrained, the understanding that some knowledge mattered regardless of power. In later periods, when descendants of these cultures inherited the tablets, without fully understanding their origins, they continued to preserve them anyway. The records were treated with respect, not because their meaning was always clear, but because they had been treated that way before. Memory, once sanctified, carries itself forward. Today, when fragments of these tablets are read, the calmness of their tone can feel unsettling. We expect ancient warnings to be loud, emotional, filled with fear. Instead, we find something quieter. A civilization that learned to live with uncertainty. A culture that understood long cycles. A system built not around panic, but around watchfulness. Nothing in the tablets says the sky will act soon. Nothing promises safety either. They sit comfortably with the idea that some things take longer than a lifetime to repeat, and that the responsibility of one generation is not to solve them, but to remember them. As the ancient night stretches on, stars rising and setting exactly as they once did, one realizes how small a single human life is within these cycles, and how gently, yet firmly, those early watchers trusted the future to continue the work they began. If attention itself can be inherited, passed quietly through clay and stone and habit, then perhaps the most enduring legacy of the first cities was not writing or law or architecture, but the simple decision to keep looking up, even when nothing seemed to be happening. The hours pass without notice. Above the sleeping land, the sky continues its slow rotation, unchanged by the presence or absence of anyone watching. The stars do not hurry. They do not announce themselves. They simply return, again and again, in the same order. For the ancient observers, this steadiness was reassuring. It meant the world was still holding together. Yet even in calm repetition, subtle differences could be felt. A star rising a little earlier than expected, a brightness lingering slightly longer in the dawn, a season arriving with a different quality than the one before. These were not disruptions, they were variations. And variation is what careful people learn to notice. Within scribal schools, young students were taught to copy tablets long before they were trusted to create new ones. Line by line, symbol by symbol, they recreated records that were older than their grandparents' grandparents. In doing so, they absorbed not only the information, but the discipline behind it. Accuracy mattered more than interpretation. They were not encouraged to speculate. They were trained to preserve. Any explanation worth making would emerge slowly, from patterns that repeated often enough to earn confidence. When new observations were added, they were placed carefully within the existing framework. A single event was never enough to change the record. Only when something returned, more than once, across years or generations, did it begin to shape expectation. This patience defined their relationship with time. Short-term thinking had little value in a system built to span centuries. Some tablets include notations that can feel almost gentle in their restraint. Rather than warning of disaster, they simply advise caution, watchfulness during certain periods, awareness during others. Nothing more. The sky, in these moments, is treated like weather. Sometimes it is quiet, sometimes unsettled, always deserving respect. There is no sense of human struggle against it, only adaptation. This attitude extended beyond the temples and tablets. Festivals and rituals gradually aligned themselves with moments marked as significant in the records. What later generations experienced as religious observance may have begun as timing systems, ways of ensuring that large groups of people paid attention at the right moments. By embedding observation into culture, vigilance became effortless. No one had to remember to watch the sky. The calendar did it for them. As cities expanded and populations grew, the original purpose of these rhythms faded from everyday awareness. People followed rituals without needing to know their origins. That was enough. The structure continued to function even when its deepest meaning became obscured. This is how memory survives long spans of time, not by remaining clear, but by remaining useful. Centuries later, when different cultures inherited the land, they rebuilt on the same foundations. New languages replaced old ones. New gods received prayers. Yet the key alignments remained. Walls still faced certain horizons. Important days still clustered around the same seasons. Records still noted familiar patterns in the sky. Continuity does not require understanding, it requires repetition. From our vantage point now, surrounded by modern light and constant motion, the Sumerian world can feel impossibly slow. A place where nothing dramatic seems to happen, where attention stretches thin across decades. But this slowness was its strength. It allowed small things to matter. It allowed memory to accumulate without urgency. It created room for knowledge that did not need to announce itself loudly to endure. And perhaps that is why these records remain so difficult to categorize. They do not fit neatly into science or religion, myth or measurement. They occupy a quieter space in between, where observation becomes tradition, and tradition quietly guards survival. As the stars continue their patient circuits above an ancient landscape now reduced to ruins and dust, one thought settles gently into place. The earliest writers did not rush to explain the universe. They chose instead to keep it familiar. And in doing so, they trusted that whatever needed to be known would reveal itself, not through fear or prophecy, but through calm attention, carried forward night after night by people willing to keep watching. The land eventually learned new names. Languages shifted, borders moved, kingdoms rose and dissolved into memory. Yet the sky above the ancient plains remained unchanged, continuing its slow patterns as it always had. When later civilizations arrived, they found traces of what came before. Broken platforms, reused foundations, fragments of clay pressed with unfamiliar signs. Much of the original meaning was already distant by then, but the habits endured. They still watched the sky. Not with the same quiet patience, perhaps, but with enough consistency to keep the old rhythms alive. Calendars were inherited and adapted. Star names were translated, reshaped, passed into new tongues. What had once been careful observation slowly became tradition, and traditions softened into story. This change was not a loss, it was survival, because stories travel where technical records cannot. They persist when languages fracture and knowledge is thinned. They carry patterns forward when details become too heavy to hold all at once. So the skywatchers of later ages heard of floods and fire from above, of darkness that lingered too long, of winds without rain and stars that returned after long absences. They did not always know where these stories began, but they repeated them, and beneath those repetitions, the original patterns remained faintly intact. In the quietest Sumerian texts, there is a sense that the writers understood this inevitability. They did not insist on eternal clarity. They built redundancy instead. Architecture mirrored observation. Ritual mirrored calculation. Language echoed memory. If one element failed, another might survive. What matters is not whether every detail remained accurate. What matters is that attention never fully disappeared. Even today, when archaeologists gently brush dust from an ancient tablet, they encounter this calm insistence. The clay does not ask to be believed, it does not demand urgency, it simply offers continuity. This was seen, this was noted, this returned. And the quiet confidence beneath those statements suggests something almost restful, a trust that time itself would eventually circle back, just as the stars did. From this perspective, the ancient focus on the sky feels less like fear and more like acceptance. Acceptance that human lives are brief, that civilizations rise and settle like silt, that the heavens move on scales too large to react to impulsively. The appropriate response, then, is steadiness, to observe without panic, to remember without obsession, to pass knowledge forward gently without forcing it. As night continues its slow progress, one might imagine a lone observer standing on a long crumbled platform, breath visible in the cool air, eyes lifting not with expectation, but with familiarity, not hoping for anything, not fearing anything, simply continuing a practice that has outlived countless generations. And perhaps that is the softest truth these ancient records offer. That survival over long stretches of time does not come from knowing exactly what will happen, but from remaining attentive enough to recognize it when it does. Time passes almost unnoticed when nothing is demanding attention. The sky continues its slow unfolding, star by star, season by season. Below it, the land rests, shaped by memory rather than motion. Ruins lie quiet. Riverbeds shift gently. Wind traces paths that have existed longer than names. In the ancient world, this stillness was not emptiness. It was space for noticing. The people who inherited the earliest records did not see themselves as pioneers. They rarely described beginnings. Instead, they spoke of restorations, renewals, returns. Their language suggests a mindset shaped by continuity, not progress. What mattered was not discovering something new. What mattered was failing to forget. In this way, knowledge became something almost moral. To observe was a duty. To preserve was a responsibility. To neglect watchfulness was not ignorance, but carelessness. Yet even this sense of responsibility was gentle. There were no looming deadlines in the texts, no exact moments circled in urgency. The sky moved too slowly for that. Patterns unfolded over centuries, and patience was expected. When a generation added its own observations, it did so without replacing what came before. Older records were not corrected or dismissed, they were layered. New clay pressed against old memory, reinforcing rather than revising. This layering mattered. It allowed uncertainty to remain intact. Instead of choosing one explanation, the records held several possibilities side by side. If a pattern appeared to break, it was noted but not forced into resolution. Time would clarify it, or it would fade naturally into the background. This restraint is easy to miss. We often imagine ancient people as urgently trying to explain the world. In reality, the earliest writers often seemed content to let the world remain partially unexplained, as long as it was carefully observed. Understanding was allowed to be incomplete, and perhaps that is why the system endured. Long after the original observers were gone, long after the reasons for certain alignments had blurred into ritual, the act of watching itself continued. It became embedded in daily life so deeply that it no longer felt like work. Calendars told people when to gather. Festivals told them when to pause. Stories told them what to remember. Together, they maintained awareness without strain. When modern scholars examine what survives, they often search for urgency hidden beneath the calm. They expect warnings written in bold strokes. Instead, they find quiet consistency. The sky mattered, not always, not urgently, but reliably. And reliability was enough. Perhaps that is the most unfamiliar idea to us now, that vigilance does not have to feel like fear, that awareness does not require constant alarm, that preparation can exist without expectation. As the night grows deeper and stars drift into positions they have occupied countless times before, one thought settles slowly. The ancient watchers were not trying to predict the future. They were trying to make sure the future could still notice the past. And in that effort, soft, patient and unassuming, they succeeded. The clay remained. The patterns endured. The sky continued. And between them, across the long quiet of centuries, attention never completely vanished. The sky moves on, indifferent to how it is understood. Its rhythms remain steady whether anyone notices them or not. Yet in the ancient world, noticing was everything. Not because the heavens demanded meaning, but because they offered repetition, and repetition, quietly observed, can teach patience better than any lesson. As generations passed, the original observers slowly disappeared into the background of their own systems. What had once required careful training became habit. What had once been written with focused attention became tradition copied by routine. This change did not weaken the system, it softened it. Soft systems last longer. They bend without breaking. They survive misunderstanding. They continue even when their deepest reasons fade from memory. The Sumerian records endured not because everyone remembered why they mattered, but because enough people believed they should be preserved. And so the sky remained part of daily life, not through fear, but through familiarity. Farmers planted by seasons shaped long ago. Priests marked days whose significance predated their explanations. Scribes recorded patterns they trusted without needing to master every implication. Over time, the precision blurred, but the structure remained intact. It is tempting to imagine a moment when everything suddenly made sense to the ancient watchers, a discovery, a realization, a turning point. But the tablets do not suggest that kind of clarity. They suggest something quieter, learning through slow accumulation, understanding spread across lifetimes, knowledge that never fully belonged to any single generation. From this perspective, the earliest writing begins to look less like invention and more like caretaking. The clay tablets functioned as anchors, holding patterns steady against the shifting currents of time. Even when empires fell, even when cities were abandoned, the tablets stayed, buried, forgotten, preserved by accident perhaps, but preserved nonetheless. Centuries later, when they were lifted back into the light, they carried no instructions for urgency, no commands to act, only reminders that someone, long ago, paid attention. That alone was enough. As night continues to stretch across the world, and the same stars rise that once guided ancient observers, the feeling left behind is not dread, but continuity. Whatever the sky once taught them, it taught them slowly. Whatever they learned, they chose to pass it on without insistence. And whatever we take from their records now, it arrives gently, filtered through clay, dust, and time, asking only that we listen quietly and remember that patience itself can be a form of wisdom. Night settles fully now, and the world grows simpler. Sounds soften, details fade. The sky becomes a slow, familiar presence rather than something to be examined closely. For the ancient watchers, this was not the end of observation, but its most natural state, attention without effort. What survives in their records suggests they understood something subtle, that knowledge lasts longer when it is calm. When information is delivered gently, without urgency, it becomes easier to carry. It slips into habit. It weaves itself into daily life and remains there quietly, even when conscious awareness drifts. The Sumerian tablets feel shaped by this understanding. They do not shout across time. They do not plead for belief. They do not warn in sharp language. They simply remain. In that remaining, they teach by example. Even their silences matter. Entire periods pass with no commentary beyond routine counts and expected returns. These quiet stretches remind us that most of time is uneventful. Stability is not absence, it is continuity, and continuity was what they valued most. When changes did come, when climates shifted, when cities were abandoned, when people moved elsewhere, the old patterns did not vanish completely. They travelled in fragments, in stories simplified enough to remember, in rituals whose original purpose blurred, but whose timing remained intact. Memory learned to wear many forms. Where clay tablets were lost, words survived. Where words drifted, habits endured. Where habits faded, stories lingered. This layering ensured that no single failure erased everything. Seen this way, ancient skywatching becomes less about anticipating catastrophe and more about accepting scale, about understanding that the universe moves on rhythms far larger than human fear. What mattered was staying connected to those rhythms, calmly, patiently, without expecting mastery. Perhaps this is why the earliest writings do not dramatize discovery. They do not frame knowledge as conquest. The sky was never something to defeat or control. It was something to live alongside, to observe as one observes a river, knowing it may flood or recede, but trusting that attention brings resilience. As the night continues its slow passage, the same stars rise again, just as they did for those ancient observers. Their names have changed, their meanings have shifted, but their return remains reliable. And in that reliability lies a quiet comfort. The first writers did not give us answers, they gave us a way of watching, and maybe that, more than any warning or prediction, was what they hoped would survive. The darkness holds steady, and nothing asks to be resolved. At this hour, the sky no longer invites study. It simply exists, wide and untroubled, moving on its ancient schedule. The land below reflects this calm, as if it too remembers a time when patience was the most important skill a person could learn. For the first watchers, there was comfort in this regularity, not because it guaranteed safety, but because it offered orientation. No matter how much changed on the ground, floods, droughts, shifting borders, the sky remained a dependable reference. It gave structure to time itself. Days were not abstract units. Years were not numbers. They were patterns felt through repetition. And by anchoring their understanding to the heavens, early societies grounded themselves in something larger than daily uncertainty. This perspective shaped how they thought about the future. There was no sense of finality in their records, no expectation of culmination. Instead, there is an acceptance that whatever comes will come again, in some form, and that preparation lies not in prediction, but in memory. To remember is to be ready. Yet readiness, as they practiced it, did not require constant attention. It required trust in systems that worked quietly, without supervision. Once the framework was built, it could outlast its builders. This trust extended not just across generations, but across centuries of misunderstanding. People copied tablets they could no longer fully interpret. They honoured alignments whose original significance was forgotten. They preserved rhythms that no longer seemed relevant, and still the patterns held. From our modern vantage point, this might look inefficient. Why keep knowledge you do not entirely comprehend? Why maintain rituals whose purpose has faded? But survival often favours redundancy over clarity. By allowing meaning to blur while structure remained, the ancient watchers ensured that something essential endured, even if details were lost along the way. The night sky did not need to be decoded perfectly to remain useful. It only needed to be noticed. As the hours drift on, thoughts slow. Questions soften. The impulse to extract conclusions fades, replaced by a gentler awareness of continuity. Whatever lessons the ancient skywatchers hoped to pass forward, they did so without urgency. They trusted that the future would uncover meaning at its own pace, when it was ready. And perhaps that trust was well placed. Here, in the quiet of the present moment, with the same stars overhead and the same cycles unfolding, it becomes easier to understand why they chose patience over proclamation. Some knowledge is not meant to wake us. It is meant to stay with us, quietly through the night. The night lingers, unbroken and gentle. Nothing presses forward. Nothing asks for certainty. The sky remains, turning slowly, unconcerned with the passage of centuries or the shifting meanings assigned to its light. For the ancient observers, this unhurried movement was not dullness, it was reassurance, because a world that changes slowly is a world that can be remembered. The earliest records do not try to outpace time, they move with it. They allow years to pass between observations. They accept gaps. They leave space for forgetting and returning again. This is not negligence, it is confidence. Confidence that attention, once established, does not need constant reinforcement. When a culture reaches that level of trust in its systems, vigilance becomes almost invisible. It blends into the background of life, no more burdensome than breathing or sleeping. Perhaps this is why the skywatchers rarely spoke of themselves. They left no personal accounts, no declarations of importance. Their presence is implied, not announced. They were there, that was enough. As centuries layered themselves over the old cities, the watchers gave way to successors who no longer knew their names. The work continued without attachment to origin. Ownership of the knowledge dissolved into collective habit. This anonymity is telling. They did not see memory as belonging to individuals. It belonged to the land, the sky, and the slow agreement between them. Even when new cultures claimed the same ground, the habits persisted. Temples were renamed, ceremonies reinterpreted. Yet people still gathered at familiar times, still marked familiar stars, still oriented themselves by the same distant lights. The system did not resist change, it absorbed it. Modern minds often assume that preservation requires rigidity. In truth, endurance often depends on flexibility, on allowing meaning to drift while function stays intact. The ancient skywatchers seem to understand this instinctively. They did not build monuments that demanded interpretation. They built practices that could survive misunderstanding. By the time their tablets were buried beneath sand and silence, the work no longer required them. And that may have been their intention all along. Now, long after the cities have returned to dust, their approach still offers something quietly valuable. Not an answer, not a warning, but a way of relating to time that does not exhaust the mind. To notice without urgency, to remember without fear, to trust that continuity itself holds meaning. As the night draws deeper and the stars continue their patient course, there is nothing left to solve, only something to sit with. And in that stillness, the ancient choice becomes clear. When the world is vast and time is long, the most sustainable response is not alarm, but calm attention, carried forward gently until morning. The quiet remains, steady and unbroken. There is a point in the night when thought loosens its grip, when questions no longer seek answers and simply rest where they are. For the ancient observers, this state was familiar. Watching the sky for hours at a time teaches patience not through effort but through acceptance. Nothing can be hurried. Stars rise when they are ready. Seasons arrive when they must. Cycles close only after they have run their full course. The early skywatchers shaped their lives around this understanding. They did not measure time to control it, but to move alongside it. The calendars they kept were not schedules imposed on the world, but reflections of the world's own pacing. This alignment brought a kind of quiet stability. When life became difficult, as it always does, there was comfort in knowing that not everything was unpredictable. Some things returned no matter what. Light followed darkness. Darkness gave way again. The sky remembered even when people struggled to. This reassurance did not require explanation. It was felt, and feeling, once ingrained, lasts longer than instruction. As generations passed, the original intention behind careful observation may have softened, but the emotional foundation remained. People continued to sense that certain moments mattered more than others. Certain nights felt worthy of pause. Certain seasons invited reflection rather than action. These intuitions were the after-images of long-forgotten attention. In this way, ancient knowledge did not disappear, it diffused. It spread thinly across culture, shaping behavior without demanding awareness. The sky no longer needed full explanation to guide life gently forward. Even now, thousands of years later, something similar persists. We still measure time by the same turning heavens. We still mark days by the sun and months by the moon. We still feel a pull toward the night sky that is difficult to name. Not because we expect something to happen, but because watching feels natural. Perhaps the earliest writers understood this better than we do. They did not burden the future with instructions. They offered patterns instead, trusting that recognition would occur when it was needed. Their legacy is not urgency, it is continuity. And as the night moves quietly toward morning, the same stars dim in the approaching light, just as they have countless times before. Nothing announces the transition. It happens gently, without ceremony. The sky changes, and the world, as it always has, continues on. The horizon begins to pale almost imperceptibly. It does not interrupt the night, it simply eases into it, light thinning the darkness in the same gradual way it always has. This moment, neither fully night nor day, was familiar to the ancient watchers. It was a time of quiet attention, when the sky revealed its last details before letting them go. At dawn, some stars disappeared all at once. Others lingered faintly, resisting the light. These final moments were often the most carefully noted, not because they were dramatic, but because they were transitional. Transitions mattered to people who understood time as a continuous movement rather than a sequence of separate events. The tablets reflect this sensitivity. Many observations focus not on peaks, but on thresholds, first appearances, last visibility, moments when change could be detected gently without force. This way of watching required patience more than effort. It taught observers to wait without expectation, to notice without attachment, to accept that meaning emerges slowly, if it emerges at all. When morning fully arrived, attention shifted back to the land. Work resumed, fires were tended, fields were walked. The sky faded into the background, but it was never forgotten. It remained present as reference, as rhythm, as memory. Throughout the day, its influence lingered invisibly. Time was still measured against its movements. Plans aligned quietly with patterns established long before. Even when eyes were lowered, awareness remained. This balance between watching and living was essential. The ancient watchers did not retreat from the world to study the heavens. They lived within the world while keeping the sky in view. Observation was not an escape, but an integration. And that integration is perhaps the most enduring lesson carried forward. Knowledge does not need to stand apart from life to matter. It can exist quietly alongside routine, shaping decisions gently without demanding focus. As daylight grows stronger, the stars fully withdraw. They are gone, yet not absent. Their return is already accounted for. No one worries about whether they will come back. They always do. This certainty closes the night without conclusion, without resolution. There is nothing to finish, nothing to decide. Only a sense of continuity carried forward once more. The ancient watchers trusted this cycle completely. They placed their faith not in prediction, but in return. Not in certainty, but in pattern. And as morning settles over a world very different from theirs, the same sky continues its patient work, holding time together, quietly, until night comes again. Morning settles fully now, soft and unremarkable. The night withdraws without protest, and with it the stars fade from view, not as an ending, but as a pause. For the ancient observers, this moment carried no finality. The sky was never gone, only hidden by light, waiting its turn to return. Life moved forward. Footsteps crossed packed earth. Water was drawn from the river. Clay was kneaded and shaped by hands that had learned their motions from generations before. The rhythm of the day resumed, steady and familiar. And beneath it all, the same quiet framework remained in place. The careful watching of the night did not interrupt daily life. It supported it. Time was understood not as something rushing forward, but as something looping gently, carrying people with it. This way of seeing time shaped how memory was held. There was no urgency to record everything. Only what returned mattered. Only what repeated deserved careful attention. Single events could be noted, but they were allowed to rest until they either faded or proved themselves by coming back. The ancient skywatchers trusted repetition more than explanation. They did not demand answers from the heavens. They waited to see what the heavens chose to repeat. In this patience, their approach differed greatly from our own. We often look for meaning immediately. We seek conclusions quickly. We want clarity now. They were content with continuity. If a pattern existed, it would reveal itself over time. If it did not, it would dissolve naturally. Nothing needed to be forced. This attitude softened fear. When uncertainty stretched across years instead of moments, it lost its sharpness. Long cycles were less frightening than sudden shocks. Slow change could be lived with. Perhaps this is why the records feel so calm, even when hinting at disruption. The language never hurries. It trusts time to carry consequences gently, without surprise. As cities expanded and shrank again, this calm seeped into everything. Architecture mirrored it. Writing reflected it. Ritual absorbed it. Even decline did not erase it. When populations thinned or political order fractured, the habits of observation often persisted quietly in smaller forms. Families passing down calendars, local traditions keeping track of seasonal signs, fragments of older knowledge lived rather than written. This diffusion made memory resilient. Knowledge no longer depended on centralized institutions or perfect understanding. It survived by being ordinary. And this ordinariness is easy to overlook. It does not stand out dramatically in history books. It leaves few monuments, but it carries on quietly, shaping how people relate to time, uncertainty, and the natural world. In the end, the ancient watchers did not try to master the sky. They learned to coexist with it. They accepted that some things are larger than explanation, slower than urgency, and patient beyond comfort. As the day unfolds and attention drifts naturally away from the night, the sky above continues its unseen movement, holding its patterns in place until they are needed again. Nothing has concluded. Nothing has begun. The cycle simply waits. The day carries on without ceremony. Shadows shorten. Heat settles into the ground. The river moves with the same unhurried certainty it always has, reflecting a sky now too bright to reveal its deeper motions. To the ancient observers, this part of the day required no special attention. What mattered had already been seen, or would be seen again when night returned. Time, in this world, was not something to chase, it unfolded. The people who lived here understood that most things worth knowing reveal themselves slowly. Crops do not grow all at once. Rivers do not change course in a single season. Even memory does not arrive fully formed. It accumulates gently through repetition. Their way of watching the sky belonged to this same rhythm. There was no expectation that one generation would understand everything. Knowledge was not owned, it was carried. Each observer added a thin layer, knowing it might be years or lifetimes before its meaning became clear. This acceptance eased the burden of knowing. If something did not make sense yet, that was not a failure. It was simply unfinished. Because of this, uncertainty was not treated as an enemy. It was treated as part of the landscape, like dust in the air or heat on the horizon. Something to live with, not eliminate. When signs appeared that later generations would interpret as warnings, they were not framed that way originally. They were markers, points of reference, moments that deserved remembering, not reacting to. The distinction matters. To remember is calm, to react is urgent. The ancient records rarely demand reaction, they preserve awareness instead. Even when disruptions occurred, floods, abandonments, the quiet collapse of cities, the sky remained constant in its cycles. This contrast likely reinforced the belief that stability existed beyond immediate circumstances. What rises will fall. What fades will return. If not in the same form, then in pattern. As years turned into centuries, the people who continued these practices may not have known why their ancestors had begun them, but they understood that stopping felt wrong. Attention, once normalized, feels necessary even without explanation. And so the practice endured, slipping from conscious intention into instinct. In this way, ancient skywatching becomes less about astronomy and more about mindset, a way of being with time that resists urgency, embraces patience, and trusts continuity. From such a perspective, the sky does not threaten, it reminds. It reminds those who watch that life is brief, cycles are long, and memory works best when it is not strained. As the afternoon light softens and the day begins its slow turn back toward evening, the ancient choice becomes clearer. They did not try to outrun uncertainty. They learned to live alongside it. And that quiet decision, repeated countless times beneath the turning sky, became one of the most enduring structures they ever built. Stronger than walls, lighter than words, and patient enough to last. The light begins to shift again, almost without notice. What was once bright becomes gentler. Shadows lengthen. Heat releases its hold on the ground, and the air changes character, preparing for night without any sudden signal. In the ancient world, this transition was familiar and unremarkable. Evening did not announce itself. It arrived. For those who watched the sky, this return toward darkness carried no drama. It was simply a reminder that another cycle was completing itself, and another was about to begin. The same sequence, trusted and known, unfolding once more. As the land cooled, attention loosened. People gathered, ate, rested. Conversations softened. The work of the day slipped behind them without needing closure. What mattered had been done, and soon the sky would return to view. This predictability shaped how ancient people understood endurance. They did not expect stability to mean permanence. They expected movement, but movement that stayed within bounds. The sky taught this lesson every night. Stars arrived, stayed briefly, and left. Yet the pattern remained, consistent enough to trust. What disappeared was never assumed lost. It would come back, changed perhaps by position, but recognizable. Memory followed the same logic. Some knowledge faded into the background, some meanings shifted, but the outlines stayed intact, ready to sharpen again if needed. As dusk deepened, the first stars emerged quietly, not competing with one another, not drawing attention. One by one they took their places. Nothing rushed, nothing demanded notice. This gradual return was the foundation of ancient watchfulness. If something unusual appeared, it would stand out naturally against the familiar order. No search was required, only presence. This may explain why the earliest records rarely express fear. A system built on familiarity does not startle easily. It absorbs irregularity without panic, allowing difference to reveal itself gently. Night watching was not constant vigilance, it was calm readiness. You stood where you always stood, you looked where you always looked, and you trusted that what mattered would show itself. Such an approach does not exhaust the mind. It allows attention to widen rather than narrow. Over time, this creates resilience, a capacity to hold uncertainty without tension. Perhaps this is what the ancient watchers truly left behind. Not instructions, not warnings, not predictions, but a relationship with time that made long memory possible. As darkness settles once more over the land, and stars gather quietly overhead, the same rhythm returns. A rhythm that has repeated so many times it no longer needs explanation. And somewhere in that repetition, meaning waits. Not urgently, not insistently, but patiently, for anyone still willing to notice. Night takes its place again without resistance. The sky deepens, colours drain away. The familiar dark returns, wrapping the land in the same calm it has offered for thousands of years. Above it, the stars settle into patterns that feel almost domestic in their familiarity. For the ancient watchers, this moment did not signal duty. It signalled alignment. Everything was once again in the position where it could be seen clearly, without strain, without expectation. The work of attention resumed naturally, not because someone commanded it, but because the conditions allowed it. Watching the sky was never separate from rest. It was woven into it. People learned early on that attention does not have to be sharp to be effective. A relaxed gaze notices more than a tense one. A mind that is not hunting for meaning is often better at recognizing change. This is why the old records feel unhurried. They were created by people who understood that the sky does not reward impatience. You cannot demand revelation from it. You can only meet it where it is, night after night, letting familiarity do most of the work. When something new appeared, it did not shout. It simply did not belong. That difference was enough. In this way, the ancient practice relied less on analysis and more on intimacy. You know what is unusual only after spending long enough with what is normal. The sky became familiar in the same way a landscape does, through repeated, unremarkable encounters. Nothing dramatic, just time. Over years, this closeness softened the boundary between observer and world. The sky was no longer out there, distant and abstract. It was part of lived experience, as present as weather or soil. And because it was present, it could be trusted. Trust reduces fear. If something could return without explanation, it could be faced without panic. The ancient watchers did not need certainty to remain calm. They needed continuity. This calm was not ignorance. It was confidence built slowly, layer by layer, through attention that never forced itself forward. When later generations inherited this posture toward the sky, they inherited the calm as well, even when the original reasons had faded. The mood survived longer than the message. A society can forget explanations and still remember how to feel. That may be why so much of the ancient world feels quieter than we expect, less alarmed, less urgent, less driven by the need to resolve everything immediately. They lived inside longer arcs of time, and inside those arcs, patience was a necessity, not a virtue. As the stars continue their silent movement overhead, repeating paths laid down long before memory began, the ancient choice feels almost intuitive. When the universe moves slowly, the best response is to slow with it, to watch without demand, to remember without weight, to let meaning arrive in its own time. And so the night holds, steady and complete, not offering answers, only continuity. A continuity that asks nothing from us now, except perhaps the same thing it asked of them, to notice, and to let the noticing be enough. The stars continue without interruption. They rise, settle into place, and drift onward, indifferent to how much attention they receive. For the ancient observers, this indifference was comforting. It meant the sky did not react to human fears or hopes, it simply followed its path. That reliability shaped how people understood endurance. If something did not respond to urgency, then urgency was unnecessary. Instead, the value lay in presence. Many nights passed without anything worth recording. Those nights were not failures, they were confirmations. Each ordinary sky reinforced familiarity, deepening the sense that change, when it came, would be recognizable precisely because most nights were the same. This is a quiet but powerful idea. When life is dominated by repetition, difference becomes visible without effort. The ancient records rarely note surprise. They note divergence, something appearing slightly out of place, something returning sooner or later than expected. These observations are small but consistent. Smallness was enough. There was no need to magnify meaning. It emerged naturally from contrast. And so the sky. It taught restraint. It taught observers to resist exaggeration, to resist conclusion, to resist the impulse to turn observation into urgency. The work was simply to keep the record intact, to preserve continuity so that future eyes could recognize what earlier eyes had seen. This approach required humility. No single observer could claim full understanding. No single generation could own the pattern. Knowledge belonged to time itself, and humans merely participated in holding it. Perhaps this is why the ancient writings feel so impersonal. Names are rare. Individual voices are absent. The focus remains on what is seen, not who sees it. Attention mattered more than identity. As centuries drifted by, this quiet posture toward the sky shaped culture in subtle ways. It softened the relationship with uncertainty. It made room for questions without pressure to answer them immediately. Something watched over long periods becomes less frightening, even if it is powerful. The sky did not need to be controlled. It needed to be understood gently, through patience rather than force. And when patience ran out, when languages shifted, when cities were abandoned, when records were buried, the posture itself remained. Later generations continued to look upward at night, not always knowing why they felt compelled to do so. The habit survived where explanation did not. Now, far removed from those early watchers, the same stars trace the same paths. Light pollution dims their presence, names have changed, meanings have shifted, but the pattern remains. And in the quiet hours, when the sky is still visible and the world slows enough to notice, something of that ancient calm can still be felt. Not a message, not a warning, just a reminder that attention, sustained gently over time, can outlast almost anything. The ancient watchers did not try to master the night. They learned to live alongside it. And perhaps, in doing so, they left behind their most durable gift. Not knowledge locked in words or monuments, but a way of being with the unknown that never needed to rush. The night reaches its quiet middle. There is a point when even the idea of watching dissolves, when attention becomes effortless, spread thin and wide like the dark itself. For the ancient observers, this was the most natural state. Nothing was expected to happen, nothing needed to be found, and yet everything was still being held. The sky at this hour feels settled. Movements are slower. Changes are subtle enough that they barely register unless one has spent years becoming familiar with them. This is where long memory does its work, not through effort, but through calm presence. What the ancient records suggest is that vigilance does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like rest. The scribes who maintained the sky records did not stay awake out of fear. They stayed awake because night made attention easier. Fewer distractions, fewer demands. The mind softened, and in that softness, noticing happened naturally. If something unusual occurred, it would stand out without effort, and if nothing occurred, that too was information. This understanding prevented exhaustion. A system that requires constant alarm burns out quickly. A system that accepts long periods of quiet can endure for centuries. Perhaps that is why the ancient watchers trusted their methods so completely. They did not require constant confirmation. They relied on the contrast between normal and irregular, between the expected and the slightly altered. This contrast only works when normal is deeply known. Most nights the sky simply reaffirmed itself. Stars rose where they should. Intervals remained consistent. Cycles continued without deviation. This repetition built confidence, not in prediction, but in familiarity. As time passed, this familiarity shaped how people thought about the future. Instead of seeing it as something approaching rapidly, they experienced it as something circling slowly, returning in recognizable forms. The future was not an unknown void, it was a continuation. From this perspective, even disruption became less overwhelming. Change was expected, but not constant. When it came, it was understood as part of a longer rhythm rather than a singular rupture. This approach did not eliminate uncertainty, it made it livable. In the quiet core of the night, when the sky feels widest and the land most still, that ancient calm lingers. It is not tied to belief or explanation. It exists simply as a posture, a way of relating to the unknown without tension. And maybe that was the deepest knowledge they preserved. Not what would happen, not when it would happen, but how to remain steady while waiting. The stars continue their slow passage, unconcerned with watchers past or present. And somewhere in that steady indifference lies a kind of peace, one that does not promise safety, but offers continuity. a continuity that does not demand attention, only patience. The night holds its shape, unchanging and calm. There is no signal that marks this hour as important, no sound, no shift in the air. And yet this quiet sameness is exactly what once allowed meaning to endure. When nothing interrupts the flow of time, familiarity deepens, and familiarity becomes a kind of understanding. For the ancient observers, this was enough. They did not need reassurance every night. They did not need confirmation that the sky was still worth watching. The practice had long ago proven itself simply by continuing. What mattered was not what they expected to see, it was the act of being present. Presence, sustained over long periods, gathers subtlety. It notices what hurried attention misses. It allows patterns to surface without forcing them into shape. It accepts that some things unfold too slowly to ever feel urgent. This is why the ancient records often feel incomplete to us. They were never meant to explain everything. They were meant to preserve continuity. The sky did not offer conclusions. It offered return, and return was enough to build trust. As hours pass and constellations drift westward, the mind begins to loosen its grip on linear thought. Past and future soften. Only motion remains, gentle, cyclical, without destination. In this state, it becomes easier to sense why the earliest writers were so comfortable with uncertainty. When time stretches wide, questions lose their sharp edges. They can remain unanswered without becoming threatening. The ancient watchers understood this intuitively. They did not frame the sky as a puzzle to be solved. They treated it as a companion, steady, distant, and honest in its patterns. Something to remain aware of, not dominate. This relationship shaped everything that followed. It made room for long memory. It softened fear of change. It allowed knowledge to persist without explanation. Even when records were lost or misinterpreted, the posture remained. Later generations inherited not the details, but the calm. And calm is remarkably resilient. It survives upheaval better than certainty. It adapts quietly. It waits. As the night continues and the sky completes another fraction of its endless circuit, nothing demands an ending. There is no climax approaching, no revelation waiting just beyond awareness, only continuity. And perhaps that is why the ancient tradition lasted as long as it did, not because it predicted the future, but because it taught patience with it, a patience wide enough to last through generations, a patience quiet enough to rest with the unknown. The stars go on, so does the night, and somewhere within that steady repetition, the ancient choice is still being made, again and again, without effort, to watch, to remember, to let time be long. The hours keep their gentle pace. Nothing pulls the night forward, nothing pushes it back. The sky remains open and unhurried, moving through its familiar positions as it has done for as long as there have been eyes to notice it. For the ancient watchers, this was not monotony, it was grounding. When everything else in life could change, weather, harvests, alliances, fortunes, the sky offered a form of steadiness that did not depend on human decisions. It did not respond to success or failure. It did not hurry to comfort or threaten. It simply continued. This constancy shaped a particular kind of trust, not the trust that promises safety, but the trust that the world remains readable if one stays patient enough. Patterns do not vanish simply because they are ignored for a time. They wait. This belief allowed attention to relax. There was no need to cling to every detail, no need to strain for significance. The work was not to interpret constantly, but to remain available, to return night after night, knowing that what mattered would reveal itself again if it mattered at all. This is why the ancient records often feel spare. They hold space instead of filling it. They leave room for silence, for ordinary nights, for long stretches where nothing needed to be said. Silence was not absence. It was confirmation that the pattern was intact. In modern terms, this can feel unsettling. We are accustomed to narratives that accelerate, that build towards something, that insist on resolution. The ancient skywatchers lived inside a different sense of time. Their lives were shaped less by events and more by intervals, between one rising and the next, between one cycle and its return, between one generation and the one that followed. Meaning lived in these spaces between moments, not in dramatic peaks. Perhaps this is why their legacy is difficult to summarize. It does not point cleanly toward a conclusion. It does not offer a final lesson. It simply continues to unfold, even now, in the same sky they once watched. As the night deepens and thoughts soften, the impulse to define or conclude fades with it. The ancient approach begins to make intuitive sense. When time is vast, clarity can afford to be slow. Not everything needs to be understood at once. Not everything needs to be named. Some things only need to be noticed, again and again, until familiarity itself becomes a kind of knowledge. The sky drifts onward, indifferent and steady, and somewhere within that steady movement lies the quiet inheritance left by those first watchers, not a warning written in clay, but a way of staying present through long stretches of uncertainty, a way of waiting without tension, a way of remembering without fear. The night continues, and nothing needs to happen for it to feel complete. The night remains open, unclaimed by endings. Stars continue their slow drift, crossing the sky in patterns so familiar that they barely ask to be noticed. This is the hour when the ancient watchers would have felt most at ease, not because they expected answers, but because nothing demanded them. Ease was part of the method. Attention that is relaxed lasts longer than attention driven by urgency. It survives fatigue, confusion, even forgetting. The early observers seem to understand this instinctively. Their relationship with the sky was built to endure boredom as easily as wonder. And boredom, in this context, was not failure. It was proof of stability. When nothing happened, it meant the world was behaving as expected. The records did not need constant reinforcement. Silence itself became reassurance. This is an unfamiliar idea now, in a time shaped by alerts and acceleration. But for people living within long cycles, quiet was information. Stillness was confirmation. The sky did not need to be dramatic to matter. It needed only to return. As hours pass and constellations tilt toward the west, the sense of separation between watcher and watched grows thin. The sky feels less like an object and more like a condition, something that surrounds rather than confronts. This kind of familiarity changes how uncertainty is held. When you live inside patterns long enough, you stop anticipating disruption with fear. You acknowledge it without fixation. Change becomes something that arrives within continuity, not something that shatters it. This does not eliminate loss. It softens its edge. Perhaps that is why the ancient records do not dwell on catastrophe, even when hinting at difficulty. They acknowledge disruption without magnifying it. The larger pattern always remains present in the background, steady enough to carry whatever follows. In this way, memory becomes gentle, not because it forgets, but because it does not cling. The sky teaches this lesson every night. Stars vanish into light and return again later. Nothing is lost permanently. Nothing needs to be held tightly. As the night moves on, the world rests within this understanding, whether consciously or not. The body relaxes, thoughts slow. The need to extract meaning eases into simple awareness, and somewhere in that easing, the ancient practice continues, not as ritual or record, but as posture. To stand beneath something vast without demanding it explain itself, to remain attentive without tension, to trust that what truly matters will return when it is ready. The night does not hurry toward morning, it takes its time, and in doing so, it offers the same quiet invitation it once offered to those early watchers. An invitation not to know everything, but to stay present long enough for familiarity to become its own kind of wisdom. The sky gives no signal that this hour is special. It does not mark its midpoint. It does not acknowledge how long it has been watched. It simply continues, turning gently as it has always done, indifferent to how much meaning has been placed upon it. For the ancient watchers, this indifference was not cold, it was honest. Nothing in the heavens pretended to respond to human concern. Nothing adjusted itself for comfort. And because of that, the sky could be trusted to remain what it was, unchanged by fear, untouched by hope. That reliability shaped how people learned to endure uncertainty. When the largest thing you know does not react emotionally, neither do you. Instead of seeking reassurance, the watchers learned to accept rhythm. The night would pass. The stars would change position. Morning would arrive. And then, later, the cycle would begin again. This certainty required no explanation. It was experienced. Over long stretches of time, this experience shaped a way of thinking that did not demand conclusions. The idea that something must end in order to be meaningful simply did not apply. Meaning could exist within continuation. The tablets reflect this without saying it directly. They trail off. They leave space. They record and then stop. Not because the story was finished, but because the pattern did not require narration. Modern readers often look for a final statement in ancient texts, a summary, a warning, an instruction meant for us. But the skywatchers did not write for distant audiences. They wrote for continuity, for someone who would take their place and keep going. Their work assumed that understanding would always be partial, and that partial understanding was enough. As the night deepens further, the feeling of forward motion softens. Time stretches. Thoughts drift without direction. The mind enters the same space ancient observers likely knew well, a place where awareness is wide, not sharp. In this space, urgency cannot survive. Only presence remains. Perhaps this is why the memory endured, even when meaning faded. The calm survived where explanations did not. The posture outlasted the theory. The sky did not need to be explained to remain influential. Its slow movement shaped thought simply by being there, steady and immense. As stars pass overhead, one by one, fading into the western dark, nothing announces their departure. They leave quietly, trusting their return later on. This quiet trust may be the most ancient lesson of all, that what truly matters does not vanish simply because it slips out of view, that patience does not weaken awareness, it sustains it, and that watching, when done without expectation, becomes a form of rest. The night continues, whole and unbroken, and the ancient rhythm continues with it, unchanged, asking nothing more than it always has: to remain, to notice, to let time be long.